Audience, can you see yourselves? Okay,
Yes.
I accidentally hit it off. Okay. Ready? Richard Lugar says by furthering use of ethanol, farmers are presented by the opportunity to produce a cash crop by collecting agricultural wastes. This is from BradyQuotes.com. Ethanol is made through wet and dry milling. The ethanol plant receives corn where it is ground up for use. Corn is turned to mash, which turns to simple sugars. Then the mash goes through fermentation. Gases and other things are added to a mixture to complete this process. ICMIC.com says wet milling grain kernels are separated into individual parts. Starch, fiber, and proteins are divided up. This mixture then goes through grinders to separate corn germ. This is then sent to evaporators where it is filtered and dried. Starch and the remaining water from the starch is processed in 3 different ways. One of these is fermented into ethanol. Ethanolfacts.com says that 1 acre of corn can produce enough ethanol to run a car for 72,000 miles on E10. The first step of dry milling is receiving the corn, or wheat, of course. EthanolRFA.org states that the corn or grain kernels are ground up and floured right away. This mixture is called meal. The corn or grain is then turned to mash. EthanolRFA.org says that the water is slurried into water to form mash. Enzymes are then added to the mash, turning starch into dextrose, which is a simple sugar. Ammonia is added for pH control and the nutrient for yeast. EthanolRFA.org says this. These are the steps before fermentation. The mash is processed into a high temperature cooker to kill bacteria. Ethanol.rfa.org says that while the mash is cooling, it is then transferred to fermenters. Yeast is added and simple sugar starts converting to ethanol and carbon dioxide. Now for the fermentation. ICMIC.com states that fermentation takes 50 to 60 hours. This mixture will contain 15% ethanol along with the solids of the grain and yeast. EthanolRFA.org says that during fermentation, the mash is kept cool to facilitate activity of yeast. Now for the steps after fermentation is done. Mash is transferred to a distillation column where mash is heated up. This separates the ethanol from everything. This finished product contains 95% ethanol, and the rest of solids and water is pumped out and separated from ethanol. This residue is called stillage, which is pumped into centrifuges, says ICMIC.com. Ethanol is 190 proof and is then dehydrated to 20 proof. This liquid is blended with 5% natural gas and ready for shipment to gas companies all over the world. Says EthanolRFA.org. The first step to wet milling is getting the corn. Corn is brought in and corn or grain is soaked in water and diluted sulfuric acid for 24 to 48 hours. This steeping helps with breaking the corn and grain parts into its component parts, says EthanolRFA.org. Tate and Lyle.com describes how corn is coarsely ground to separate corn germ from starch and proteins. Now in the form of slurry, corn flows to cyclone separators where germ is actually separated from corn and grain. This corn germ contains 85% corn oil and is removed from the slurry. The remaining starch, gluten, fiber is then separated into centrifuges, says EthanolRFA.org. Steeping liquid is put in the evaporator where it is co-dried with fiber and solid and sold as corn gluten feed and used to feed livestock, says EthanolRFA.org. Protein or gluten components are filtered and dried to produce the corn gluten meal. This is a co-product and feed ingredient that is used for poultry broil operations, says EthanolRFA.org. Starch and remaining water from mash are fermented into ethanol. Dry and wet milling are complicated, but work in making ethanol. Ethanol is a great and new way to reduce pollution and uses more natural ingredients for fuel. It is worth the long and complicated process. The big difference between dry and wet milling is that wet milling takes corn and grain kernels and takes components like fiber and protein apart. Dry milling grinds it all together. Wet milling makes different products throughout the processes also, such as livestock feed and feed for poultry broil operations. www.ethanolfacts.com states that a typical 40-gallon ethanol plant creates 32 full-time jobs and generates about 1.2 million tax revenue into the economy. All done.
Okay.
Audience. You got move over slightly, C Lane. Okay.